It's been an interesting week, and one of the things that I have been following is the tragedy of the Titan, that vessel that went down to explore the Titanic, and it seems like it is a tragedy now. The ocean, the sea, that big monster, it's something that has always fascinated humanity. From the early days of our history as human beings until today, we are either fascinated and or sometimes scared. Today, in our biblical reading, my brothers and sisters, we encounter a miracle that has a lot to do with the water, with the sea. Today, there's a strong reference in the Gospel of Matthew that comes to us from the book of the prophet Jonah. So there were people who came to Jesus, and then they asked him to perform a miracle so that they would start believing. And Jesus said no to them. But the way that he said no was that you have plenty of miracles. Go and examine your scriptures. And he told them that if you go and look at the example of the prophet Jonah, you will have the answer. Jonah was a prophet, and then God asked him to go and preach in the great city of Nineveh. So this was a very challenging task. Initially, the way that I would try to understand this demand that God puts on Jonah would be the following analogy. If my sarpazan tells me, go and preach in Times Square, that will not be very comfortable for me because it's outside of my comfort zone. It is preaching to people that I do not know who they are. It's big and it's intimidating. I would probably feel scared and uncomfortable to go and preach in Times Square. Maybe this is what was going on in Jonah's mind when he chose not to go to Nineveh. But when we continue reading the book of Jonah, we see the following. We see that Jonah knew who God was. And we see that Jonah knew that God could make the hearts of the people of Nineveh change. But because the Assyrians or the Babylonians were the enemies of the Israelites, he had so much negative feelings towards them. And for that reason, he didn't want to go. Now the analogy changes. Now I am asked to go and preach in Baku. That will be very, very difficult. So this was the task that was commissioned to Jonah. And Nineveh is east from where Jonah was. So what Jonah does is he goes and he finds a ship that takes him west to a town that is called Tarshish, which historians say that it is somewhere in Spain today. He wanted to disobey God. He wanted to go elsewhere. And the biblical text tells us that there was a ship that was willing to take him to Tarshish. And this detail, I think, is very important because when we choose to disobey God, when we choose to walk away from God, there will be so many things, so many occasions, so many people who would steer us away from God. So the miracle happens when he is in that ship, when there's the big storm, and people realize that this is an extraordinary storm. And then they realize that this is happening because there is someone who must have done something. And at this point, Jonah is sleeping. He's comfortable. When they wake him up, and they cast lots now, and he confesses that I'm running away from God. And then they cast him into the sea. This whole part is very important, my brothers and sisters. This is about the waves that God sends into our lives. The waves are harsh. No one wants to face the storm. But the waves that God sends, they carry also love. We feel it. We are transformed by it. It is the difficulties and the pain that each and every one of us experiences in our lives. They have a purpose in our lives. But Jonah now is in the sea, in the belly of the big fish. What happened? Why Jonah ended up in the depths of the sea? No, it was not for the men who threw him out of the ship, obviously. But there was something deeper that was happening. I think what was going on here is that same old, very familiar sin, the sin that Adam and Eve committed. It's the same thing that we all commit. The sin of pride. Pride is very dangerous, my brothers and sisters. In Jonah's case, thinking that those people of Nineveh do not deserve God's mercy, that was his sense of pride. And we are operated a lot of times from this perspective of sin. And sin works from the following two ways. There are two ways that we commit the sin of pride. It's either our ego is so much hurt that we become victims and we start complaining. Why did this happen to me? Why, God? And we operate from that perspective of always being a victim, or we start looking to others and condemning them. We start thinking that we are better than everybody else, judging them. Sometimes there's that changed sense of condemning, which is becoming an activist and trying to be a way that I will change the entire society because I know better than anybody else. This is the sin of pride, my brothers and sisters. If we fall in the first category of becoming a victim, we create a scenario where there's no hope for us. We become hopeless. If we operate in that second category, then we are telling ourselves that I am finding my way towards my salvation. I don't need a God. You see how pride operates? I don't need a God. And then whatever our cause is, that becomes our God. And that judges us. It gives us validation. It makes us who we are, and it condemns us. But it does not save us. Look at it. When we are young, we're trying to be the best student in the class or the best game player on the field. When we grow a little bit, we're trying to be the best lover. And then when we grow a little bit more, we're trying to be the best in our field of whatever we are doing. So whatever it is that we're trying to be the best at, that has become our God, and that is judging us. It is telling us how good we are. But we need the waves, and we need to go in that sea, in the belly of the big fish, where he stayed 3 days, Jonah. And in those 3 days, a transformation happened. His ego died. Jesus comes and he says today in the gospel, there's someone who's greater than Jonah who is present here. And what did Jesus do? On the cross, He emptied himself from his divinity to give us salvation. At the conclusion of our reading, Jesus says the following: when evil spirit comes out of a person, it goes and it roams around and then tells itself, let me just go back home. Let me see what happened. So he goes back home, or it goes back home, and then sees that home, the original space, is clean. And it goes out and brings 7 more wicked spirits. And the end of that person is worse than the original state. I used to find this very difficult to understand. But the message is the following, my brothers and sisters. As I said this last time, we are made for God. And if God is not in us, something else is occupying that space. That space cannot remain empty. It is always occupied by someone or something. A lot of times we say, okay, I will give this bit, only this bit to God, and then I'm going to do whatever I need to do in my life. It doesn't work like that. God wants us all, because with that, there is a transformation. In the sacrament of baptism, our ritual is to immerse the child in the baptismal font. We need to immerse ourselves in God's mercy, to let the old die and have the new to renew us.